Welcome to The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week we're talking to Dr. Rick Simpson, one of my favorite college professors from St. Bonaventure University. Dr. Rick Simpson, it is fantastic to hear your voice, and it's an honor to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining me all the way from Arizona.
That is true, and I'm honored to be here with you, Brian. It's a great delight to me to hear your voice and to think back over your years at St. Bonaventure and then what you've accomplished in the meantime. I have snuck a look at your faculty page at SUNY Oswego, and can I switch to the vernacular for a second? I'm blown away by it. I'm just blown away by what you've done and the kinds of issues you think about, the kinds of issues you deal with on a regular basis, which could probably, would it be fair to say that you're concerned with the relationship between ethics and journalism?
Definitely a huge part of what I do is looking at those relationships, and especially how they relate to the economics of journalism in this digital era, and especially with what's been happening in the last few years economically, and the ethical issues that arise with balancing trying to get an audience with doing ethical work and doing the work that journalists that we're kind of commissioned to do and supposed to do is definitely a huge part of what I do. Yeah,
that all seemed to be jumping off the page at me, and if I may be personal about this for a second, I grew up in a family. My dad was a labor economist in San Francisco. Started in the 1930s when the interactions between labor and management were at white heat. And then he continued on in the 1940s, 1950s, and he died in the late 1960s. Well, I grew up in the family. I was born in 1942, and so by the time I was a 7-year-old, I was famous in my mother's huge extended family for lying on the kitchen floor and reading the sports pages of the newspaper. And yep. And my dad had been a football player in high school and college, and his own interest in sports spilled over into my life, and so I was reading sports journalism addictively by the time, before I was a 10-year-old. I mean, I was a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, and newspapers were being delivered to the family house, first in Los Angeles, where both of my parents were born in the late 1940s, and then we moved up to the San Francisco Bay Area in 1950. And so I grew up with the San Francisco Chronicle being delivered to the house every day, and they had a great sports section. It was green. It was called the Sporting Green, and it was always the back section of the paper. And they had terrific writers. Just Bob Stevens covered the San Francisco Seals and ended up in the Hall of Fame for his efforts. Baseball's Hall of Fame. He's there as one of the in the journalistic section of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And then that spilled over into football and basketball and baseball, and I played all those sports a little bit as a kid, not very well, but I played them. And so that was all in my blood really, really early on, much more so than what I ended up teaching later by way of literature, poetry, those things. That all, the interests in those things and any kind of real understanding of those things came much later in my life, when I was in my 20s, and then later, I kept learning as I was teaching at Bonaventure. As you well know yourself, teaching is a matter more of learning than it is of teaching.
Absolutely,
in a lot of ways.
So I remember that was one of the first things that I think a lot of students, myself included, bonded with you over in our freshman year seminar or in our English classes at Bonaventure was, here's an English professor who loves baseball, who's obsessed with baseball and the Giants. And who were some of those other writers? You mentioned Bob Stevens, but what other writers do you remember from that era of the sports, reading the sports section in the newspapers?
Boy, that's a good question. That is a really good question. I wish I'd thought more about it. I can remember one other name that a writer that had a huge influence on me at the Chronicle, a guy named Charles McCabe. And McCabe started out in the 50s, as I recall. I haven't checked his story recently or deeply, but what I remember was that he was at first a sports columnist who was always flavorful. The writing was always flavorful. You know, and by the way, that this also, of course, was a love of sports announcers. I mean, early on, that's what I wanted to do. I would say to people, look, if I can't play shortstop in the major leagues, I want to be a sports announcer.
Same. Yeah.
I would say that all the time. And there was a guy named Les Keiter, Keiter, who did he did these rebroadcasts of Major League Baseball games. You know, in other words, I'm a kid who thought of Major League Baseball as something that happened 2,000 miles away. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're living in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1950s, you're dealing at close range with the Pacific Coast League, which was a terrific, almost major league, minor league. I mean, there are histories of this where the Coast League was often spoken of as a potential major league, a third major league, but it never acquired that status. But the other thing that you dealt with, this 2,000 to 3,000 miles away thing, where the St. Louis Cardinals were living on another planet, and the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers were on another planet from there. They were so far away. Well, they rebroadcast games into the San Francisco Bay Area, and Les Keiter was one of the guys that did this. And all he was doing was reading a ticker tape, and then they had these canned, crowd noises. And Les Keiter made a ball game so incredibly fun and interesting to listen to. And I'm 8 years old. I'm 9 years old. We moved into the Bay Area when I was an 8-year-old in 1950. And Keiter's on the radio and he's going, and he's struck him out. and I'm just going nuts. And he used the word baby all the time. Atta baby. Oh, Preacher Rowe just struck him out again. Atta baby, preach. And I'm just going nuts over this stuff. And I would start talking that way, and my mother would scold me. She would say, don't use the word baby that way, Rick. That's not what it means. And so I'm drunk on these guys. I'm an 8-year-old. I'm intoxicated by the language that these guys are using. Well, Charles McCabe, to jump back to him for a second, McCabe started out as a sports writer, doing columns, and I mean he was kind of the 1950s equivalent of a really good blogger. But anyway, he would have columns on the sports pages almost every day, and then midstream, and I don't know exactly when this happened. Call it 1955, call it 1957. McCabe started doing more general interest columns on a wide range of topics, including all kinds of social issues and all that kinds of stuff. And I remember McCabe as having a real influence on the way I saw the world. You know, I would never have thought of to put it this way when I was that kid. But later, as a teacher of writing, I certainly would have thought to put it. This was a guy whose vision of the world I loved to share. I loved the way the guy saw the world, and I read his columns absolutely addictively. So in other words, I was as much a product of sports journalism. I can remember when I was an undergraduate at BYU, and it was by this time majoring in English, so I was writing papers for English courses. I can remember one of my teachers saying to me in a comment on a paper, he said, you're way over into the area here of journalese. You're kind of, you've got kind of a journalistic flavor to your writing. Well, that's not appropriate in a critical paper on literature. I mean, the guy was telling me not to be who I was, and of course it was an excellent lesson. I mean, it was a lesson I had to learn the hard way a number of times in my experience as a writer. So anyway, so that's a long answer to your short question. I mean, who were some of the other guys? Well, they were there.
Yeah. What was that worldview that you described from Charles McCabe, and how did we see that as your students, and how did that kind of come out, and how you saw the world and how you taught?
Yeah, there's a great question. One I've never thought of exactly in those terms. Well, like any excellent crafter of words, Charles McCabe took his vision of the world, what he saw with his eyes, and turned it into what he said with his words. He was taking visual experience and emotional experience, kind of the interplay between his own physical senses and the external world, which is at the heart of so much good writing, and converting that experience and that understanding into words that would then be sent out to thousands of readers. And that's so simple in one way that it's ridiculous. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, it's such a huge achievement to do that with your words, where, I mean, you've been a sports writer, you go to a basketball game, well, what are you going to say about that basketball game exactly?
Right.
I mean, you're sitting there in the arena, you're looking at the game, you're watching it happen with your eyes, but then how do you turn that into language?
Yeah. And and that's something that's a challenge, especially for sports writers now, in that, I mean, this was even the case when I was a sports writer, but more so now, that most people, you're not just saying what happened. You're not just kind of saying who was the leading scorer, who hit the winning basket, all of that, because that information gets out there. This kind of gets at some of the stuff that the work I do now. And so now, What do you do? What's our role as sports reporters if we're not just straight reporting on it? And a lot of it is using that language, kind of trying to, I tell my students, use all of your senses when you're writing and reporting. It's not just what somebody says, or it's what you see in front of you. It's what you hear. It's what you all kind of taking that all in and trying to use that to describe whatever it is, whether it's news, whether it's a press briefing, whether it's a basketball game or something like that. But that's one of the challenges I think we're facing in my industry, or my old industry, I should say.
Yeah. It's very interesting, because you might as well tell them to write poetry.
Right.
I mean, really. In other words, that's absolutely one of the things that, I mean, as I may have said in class, I fell into poetry. I mean, I fell into it. I got out of high school never having been moved by a single poem, and I mean that literally. I had never been emotionally affected by any poem that I read all the way through high school. And, I mean, in the sharpest contrast to what was happening to me as a reader of journalism, as I've been making clear. So I ran into a guy named Martin Nurmi at Kent State, where I was working on a doctorate in English, and was thinking I was going to write about James Joyce's fiction for a dissertation, and made a comment about Byron's poetry in class one day, and the faculty member, Martin Nurmi, who was an expert on the British Romantics, Nurmi stared at me for a few seconds to this comment that I made about Byron, and he said, there's your paper for this course. And this was a course that was kind of a side course, because I was interested in 20th century British lit. I took the Romantics and the Victorians as two separate courses that were related to the major interest in the 20th century British writers. And so So Nurmi looked at me and said, well, you're saying something interesting about Byron, turn that into a paper. So it was supposed to be 20 pages long. My paper became 60 pages long, and Nurmi gave me an A and said, the only thing wrong with this paper is it's way too short. And he's saying, you're looking right at a doctoral dissertation on Byron. So I fell into poetry. And then Nurmi found out that I didn't know, I could slip into the vernacular here, but I won't. I didn't know anything about poetry. And he said, okay, look, for the next quarter, they were on a quarter system. And he said, the next quarter, we don't want you to teach freshman composition. We want you to teach introduction to poetry. And I said, spell that for me. Introduction to pottery? I mean, what are you talking about? And so I had to start teaching a subject I knew nothing about at the college level. And so we were using a textbook, a long, wonderful textbook. I still have a copy on my shelf that Martin Nurmi had written with Charles Felser. And I don't know anything about Felser, but Nurmi was in my life to the max at that point. And, I started reading about poetry, and one of the first things you find out is that poets are thickly physical. Mm-hmm. They use every sense that they can muster in order to respond to the world that they see around them, and then they convert that into intensely metaphorical, intensely rhythmic, intensely sonic language, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're telling your students to use all their senses? Darn right. In other words, they use their senses, and then they convert all of that sensory information into language. And some kids don't need to be told that. But what do you mean? Am I supposed to talk about the way a sports event smells? Well, why not? Why not?
Yeah.
Why not talk about the aura of cigarette smoke that used to float, and probably still does, over big-time football games? See, I live 6 blocks, if I may say so. I live 6 blocks from Stanford Stadium, and by the time I was 8 years old, I was up there in the end zone, had paid a quarter to get in, and I was sitting in the upper end of the end zone where there was all that cigarette smoke up there. Well, I was a Mormon kid growing up, and nobody smoked in my family. Well, except my dad did it. That's a whole other story. My father was not a Mormon, my mother was. But I mean, here's this aura of cigarette smoke over a football stadium, and I mean, that was a smell. That was an olfactory experience that was part of the drama and the physical intensity of big-time football. And I mean, big-time football is addictive, as this country is well aware. I mean, by the way, speaking of journalism, have you seen Last Chance U? It's a Netflix series.
I have not, no.
Anyway, I've just seen it. I've just been looking at it at the recommendation of my son, Eric. Eric said, hey, Dad, you might want to watch Last Chance U on Netflix. Well, it's worth watching. And I mean, you get an up close and personal sense of how extremely violent big time football is. These are guys playing for national rankings at the JUCO level. And it's a terrific series. I think you'll see why I'm recommending it. But I mean, it's that tremendous physical impact of football, and yeah, you're trying to translate that all through your reader for sure.
So one of the you brought up the poetry writing class, which I took and was one of my favorites, and the English Romantic upper class seminar, which I took. I became an English major because I just kept taking English minor because I just kept taking your classes, and it worked out that I had an English minor by the end of my time at school. But one of the reasons, I think I might have told this story when I had another former student of yours, Mike Farrell, on this podcast. We were talking about his books and his writing, and
great guy.
Fantastic guy, fantastic writer, and I still remember this. I owe you a thank you because one of the legitimately transformative lessons. Like one of the lessons of my college career was freshman honors seminar that I had you in. So this is back in 1995. and we had to write like an early paper, like early in the semester, and we had to bring it to you to meet with you to go over. And I think I'm like really good, and like I was a great high school writer and all this, and I bring my paper to you. You legitimately got about a page and a half in. Pages are covered with red ink. You said, no. Take this to the library, Strunk and White Rule 13. Look it up and then bring it back to me. And that's the omit needless words one. And that has stuck with me. My wife still thinks I'm too wordy, which I probably am. But, I mean, that was such a transformative lesson. It stuck with me all of these years. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, we're both sitting here thanking Strunk and White, both of them, you know.
Right. So what, kind of playing off of that, in your years teaching writing, I mean, what are some of the things you find yourself telling college age writers kind of over and over again, your kind of go-to lessons and things that you think people who are young, who are kind of entering this writing life in whatever form they want to write, what are some of your kind of go-to lessons for them, or things that all writers need to know? What was your well that you kept going back to?
Oh boy, that is another great question, and one of the portions of that answer has to do with the fact that I was lucky to encounter great teachers along the way, teachers of English, and one in particular in high school, a guy named Robert Leon, out in Palo Alto. Oh man, Martin Clark at BYU, Robert Thomas at BYU. Thomas is the guy who grabbed me by the lapels when I was in freshman English myself and said, what's your major? And I said, general college. He said, what do you want to do? And I said, I have no idea, maybe law. And he said, well, I've got a message for you. The thing you want to do in your life is to get an MA and a PhD in English, and then teach the subject the rest of your life, and you'll be a happy guy. You won't be rich, but you'll be happy. And that, I mean, you talk about transformative experiences, that was it. But Thomas yelled at me on my papers. I mean, I wrote a beautiful paper for the guy. You know, the first paper of the semester was an in-class essay, and one of the subjects was patriotism. Well, I just spent the previous year in Norway as an exchange student, and I talked about what the Statue of Liberty meant, but I found myself crying in a Norwegian classroom over, bring your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And I wrote a paper about that. Well, he thought that was one of the best in-class papers he'd ever seen by a freshman, and then I proceeded to get a series of C+ from the guy. And he yelled at me about proofreading, and he yelled at me about this and that and the other thing. Well, he was a great one. And then Martin Ermey at the graduate level, and Martin Clark at BYU, I should certainly mention him. He's another guy that yelled at me. I mean, yelled at me. Nurmi used to yell at me in the margins of my doctoral dissertation drafts. And so okay, let me get back to the great question you asked. What were the go-to things that I would tell students? One of them was that grammar doesn't matter, but it does. Another thing would be think audience, think audience, think audience, think audience. And one of the things I used to love to say in a classroom like those honor seminar classes that you took, which were small, had about 12, 14, 15 students in them, I would say, you want to know who your audience is? It's me, this funny-looking guy that's teaching the class. I'm your audience.
Mm-hmm. I remember that, yep.
Your audience. Yeah, I'm your audience, and I care about what you write, and I care about who you are, and I'm interested in what you have to say. Well, deal with me. DWI, deal with it, because I'm your audience. And if I ask you to introduce me to one of your grandparents, well, act like you mean it. Mean it when you talk about that grandparent. Give me enough information so that if I met that grandparent, walked into a room and met that grandparent, I would know exactly who I was talking to. Or I would ask you to tell me about Thanksgiving dinner. And I would say, put everything on the table. I want to know exactly what was on that table. I want to know exactly who was around that table. And I want to know exactly what the atmosphere was in the room. Was it tense? Was it friendly? Was it, were you with people that you adore? Were you with people you don't adore? I mean, tell me what was going on. And by the way, in the process, tell me what you're really thankful for, not what you're supposed to be thankful for. Well, at that point, the student knows that there's a real listener, and then I would try desperately in the comments that I wrote on my papers on the students' papers, I would try desperately to make it clear that I did care about what they had said, that I did care about it, that I wanted to treat them as a real human being, the writers. I wanted to treat them as a real human being. And yeah, grammar matters, but grammar doesn't. And I love talking about that because I think, you know what? I think that whole question of does grammar matter or not, I mean, you can do that one for hours, but I mean, here we are with social media flourishing and also, texting and all those kinds of communication. Well, you and I both know, Brian, that grammar doesn't matter when you're texting somebody. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that whole generations of students who got beaten up by English teachers for their lousy grammar, well, they couldn't care less about grammar, and they loved to just throw it out the window. Well, now we've got a culture where language gets trashed all the time. It's always gotten trashed, but boy, is it getting trashed now, but good, at the national and international level. And so you go back, and it's not that grammar is going to bail us out of the trashing of language, but it's one way to talk about the fact that language does matter, and the way people use language matters. And we end up with the society we get partly because of the way people use language.
Right.
And abuse language. So I think.
Yeah, it's very funny that you mention grammar, your discussions on grammar, as my wife, who is a copy editor, walked into our home office here to sit down to get some work done. Yeah, and but what's interesting is that my wife is the best editor I've ever known. I'm not just saying that because she's looking at me, but because she's very
give her my greetings, will you?
Yes, yeah. My college professor says hi. Not my only one. I had several, but what she does well is that when we think about grammar, I think we think about hard and fast rules, and it's much more about is your message clear, like you were saying, kind of thinking of your audience and making sure that it's clear and the audience knows what you're trying to say and the meaning of what you're trying to say. And that's what a good editor does. It's not about following strict grammar rules per se. It's about making sure that what you've written is clear and it fits to it gets your message across to whomever you're writing to.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, let me say two things quickly right here. First of all, I think learning to edit your own work well is one of the most challenging and beautiful accomplishments that anybody can come up with. And secondly, let me say again, I want to say hello to your wife. My mother was a copy editor.
Oh, really?
A university press copy editor. And then she eventually began working with my dad in the small firm that he had in San Francisco. By the way, working for a laundry list of newspaper unions in the 1950s and 1960s in San Francisco, a whole long laundry list of newspaper unions. I mean, there was a commitment to the newspaper as a crucial part of American life that was deeply embedded in my family. So, wow. Yeah, but the lesson of clarity. I mean, I think I'm quoting Strunk and White directly, the elements of style directly when I here's the direct quote: clarity, clarity, clarity. Yeah. Period. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's in there somewhere, I think.
It sounds familiar. Yeah. So I ask everybody the same question, but I'm going to ask you a curveball before I get to the usual question. Because I know you also introduced me to jazz music. So what is some of the best jazz you've been listening to lately?
Oh man, you know me. I could go on for hours about that. I'll cut to the chase. one of the things that I've done since I retired in 2016, I finally made the decision to retire in the fall of 16. Well, in the early 2000s, in 2003, I decided to take a few bucks that I had and executive produce an album, a jazz album out in L.A. with a Bonaventure graduate named Tom Rizzo, class of 72, who's a world-class guitar player. And we came up with an album that actually did pretty well. And my wife died suddenly in 2015, and I was floundering in the weeks immediately after that experience. And friends in Olean, longtime friends in Olean, said, well, when are you going to do the next one? And I said, the next what? And they said, well, the next jazz album. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you've done one. Why don't you do another one? And I thought about it for a couple of weeks, and bang, one day, suddenly I understood that I needed to call up the great guitarist Dave Stryker, Stryker, and see if he would be interested in doing something with me in that way. And he was. And a colleague of his, the saxophonist named Steve Slagle, Slagle, they had a band together, and we did an album. Well, I've done a bunch of others since then. I think the number is around 10 somewhere. And if you want to, Dave Stryker and Steve Slagle, but Stryker's been doing a series of his own albums. He is maybe my favorite jazz player on the planet right now.
All right.
And he's also a wonderful guy. So there's a quick answer to your question.
And so the question I ask everybody that I have on here that I'll ask you is, what's the best thing you've read lately?
Ooh. Boy, what a great question. Okay, I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to tell you exactly what it is. There was a movie made called Master and Commander that had Russell Crowe in it. And I read a few reviews of that when it came out, and I think like 2005 or something like that. And even though the subject matter was on the British Romantics, I kind of read the reviews and said, that's kind of interesting. But then I set it aside and forgot about it. But I read the London Times Literary Supplement, the so-called TLS, pretty often. And here, about a couple of weeks ago, was a major article on Patrick O'Brien, who wrote the nearly 20 novels, maybe it is 20, in the Master and Commander series. It's about a friendship, a maritime friendship between a guy named Aubrey and a guy named Maturin or Maturin, something like that. I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced, to tell you the truth. Well, the review was so exciting that I said, what the heck? I'm just going to pick this up and read it. Well, what the review said, by the way, was that this guy O'Brien was a writer that you could comfortably talk about in the same sentence with Jane Austen.
Ooh, okay.
And Austen's one of my absolute stoned favorite writers. And I said, no kidding. The guy writes at a level with Austen. In other words, Austen might be the best writer I've ever read except Shakespeare. I mean that. I absolutely mean that. So I've started to read Master and Commander, the first in the Aubrey Maturin series of novels. I hope I'm pronouncing the second guy's name right. And it's stunning. I'm about 100 pages into the first novel, and it is stunning. And then I'll mention Austen, and I was reading this morning, about Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great English Victorian poet. And I got this long list of favorite poets. Well, Hopkins is right smack at the top of that list, along with, the British Romantics and all those folks. But great question. And I'll just say Master and Commander by Patrick O'Brien.
Awesome. Well, yeah. Doc, this has been just an absolute joy. We could go on for hours, but I won't keep you. I won't keep you away from your work. So thanks again for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Listen, I'm not going to keep you away from your great work, and it's a joy to hear your voice. Give my regards to your wife, who's the copy editor, and And Mike Farrell and Brian Moritz and I ought to have lunch sometime.
We'll make that happen. Thanks again.
All right. Beautiful. Thanks, Brian. Take care.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.